I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. So our speaker is Simona Bose. She is currently a Master's of Philosophy in Justice and Transformation student at the University of Cape Town. She also serves as the Secretary General of the Humanities Postgraduate Student Council, and she is, of course, a member of the Africa and MENA Region Student Research Committee. She's also done several online publications on various platforms with regards to India, Indian politics, and Indian identity. And so we're very keen to hear how she draws that into her discussion on soft power and how India has used soft power in the African context today. So without any further ado, I'm going to give over to Simona. Simona, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Rion, for that very generous introduction. I think I find inspiration to just talk about India and Africa, just learning so much about Chinese involvement in Africa at the moment, and they take a lot of their involvement from their assets. And because I am an Indian in Africa, so that for me sort of drew on a bit on how I have seen the position grow. And I'm very looking forward to talking and engaging with everyone after this, and just sort of also inviting the floor on what they think about it. So Rion, is it fine if I just stop my video while I'm going through my slides, and then for the interaction I can put it on?
Yes, that's perfectly fine.
Okay. Green. Okay, I hope you guys can see this. Okay, so basically India's soft power reach in the African continent has expanded through successive governments, and the recent being Modi's government leading a very active platform in many different geopolitical regions, and Africa being a very prominent one. So it does touch a lot on the cultural sphere of India's expansion, and that's what this presentation will touch on. So a bit of concept before that, Joseph Nye, a Harvard professor, actually came up with the term soft power, and it emerged in the 1980s in the post-Cold War era, where military power, economic sanctions, and basically the traditional world order was faced with a lot of crisis from the wars that happened, the two world wars and the Cold War. So basically Western powers were looking for something different to come up with in order to persuade and have a more sort of a successive mode of functionality. And soft power basically touches on the behavioral aspects of foreign policy, and it's distinct from traditional hard power, which is based on military and economic pull. So soft power is, as short the definition talks about, the ability to co-opt and attract rather than coerce and compel. And it's a very fluid concept, so it can touch on different themes of how to persuade. And soft power's currency relies on cultural exchanges, values, ethos, and basically is based on foreign policies. And it's more of the optimist and positive facets of diplomacy, interchange, and communicable missions through bilateral or unilateral platforms. Traditionally, as we've seen, as the Western world and the world order has sort of developed more and more through the hard power lens, it has been a traditional indicator of sovereignty and agency. But post-Cold War, as Joseph Nye indicated, that soft power has been a trusted alternative because it is applicable anytime. There is no beginning or end to it. So a country or a nation state, or even domestically, soft power can be a tool that is quite a strong alternative when states or actors want to go about in an amicable way for decision making, policy making, and we do see soft power being used quite a lot in contemporary times. So to just sum up the concept, soft power is a tool to form preferences, choices through appeal, attraction, and cultural symbolism, which is very important to promote sustainability and persuasion. So coming from the soft power point of view in the Indian perspective, now when we see China's involvement in Africa, we see they have their own soft power going on, but they have a more of an economic stronghold, whereas India culturally, viably, has always been a historical actor to practice symbolic and more cultural methods of engagement. So since independence, India has become an influential international relations actor because of its unique cultural, geopolitical, and sustainable economic growth throughout the years. And of course, our current prime minister has also, under his government, has taken a stride to use soft power and cultural ties. And a very big part of his regime is utilizing soft power to gain more prominence. Our first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, had, of course, been a founding member of the non-alignment movement, which heavily endorsed South-South cooperation. And when we see the global South, actually, soft power is a very powerful, and it is more of a regular tool to use. And I'm just going to expand a bit on that later on. So India as a civilizational power is also very representative of the history, culture, and arts. And that has been sort of India's superpower, along with other things diplomatically. But it's a very unique case to see India's soft power grow immensely throughout the years. And we see noted Indian diplomat and former UN Secretary General candidate Shashi Tharoor talk about India's soft power being a very prominent tool of its foreign policy lately. And it includes entertainment, diaspora slash diplomacy, fashion, food, music, sport, culture, not to mention literature and all of that. So the historical context of India being in Africa, so both continents, I would say Asia, Africa, even Latin America, they have struggled with colonial rule, and post-transition, they have stumbled upon different angles to approach development. And India has been an influential player when it comes to migration and just export import when it comes to historically inserting positions of power, trade in Africa, actually. So particular countries like South Africa, Mauritius, Kenya, they house a sizable diaspora of persons of Indian descent because of early migration through the 1700s. And we see Gandhi's arrival into South Africa also spearheading a very influential phase in where more Indian persons traveled to South Africa, partook in the anti-apartheid struggle, and actually formed a very big diaspora here. Actually, South Africa houses, I think, the most number of Indian people. So the biggest diaspora outside of India is South Africa, and Durban is the biggest city with an Indian population outside of India. So that's quite an achievement geopolitically as well, because we're yielding towards how migration has also trickled down through generations. And of course, as I mentioned, the global South connection, there is a specific motive of development and globalization, but also modernizing it through their own specific standards. So India, in that sense, has progressed a lot through soft power tools in becoming a big socio-cultural player. And this is also to foster a stronger South-South cooperation, because if we see other regional blocs, they also have a lot of different tools to use in building up the South-South cooperation. So to begin off with this, India and Africa's engagement has several common goals which start off the margin. So before soft power was it was introduced, but not really proliferated. These were the common goals. So there was a call for political reform and global governance, specifically the P5 membership in particular. South Africa and India have been competing for a more durable and more visible role in the United Nations Security Council. So we see that there is more of a struggle put on by them for representation. The civil society in both countries, although they have their own contemporary struggles, are increasing with global justice, equality, development, and education. So both respective partners have that strive towards aiming for these particularly engaging areas. Respect for sovereignty and domestic affairs. I think African states and India particularly have expressed the need to respect sovereignty, and which is why they may have this push for non-interference. And India is a major player for that, and that can also influence in the future how the global sphere works around human rights and civil society in that angle. Examples of BRICS and the India-South Africa Business Forum, India-Africa Forum Summit, these are all economic regional blocs and economic institutions that have also forwarded economic partnership. And the business development partnership, which is a general industry-oriented growth, which is telecommunications, pharmaceuticals, banking. And we see a lot of Indian nationals and Indian diaspora engaging in multi-sectoral recruitment, jobs, basically trade-offs with which nationality gets to work where. It's like a very offshore sort of industry as well. And India is also one of the major export markets for Africa. So economically also, India has become a very viable target destination for Africa for the trade sector. So it was the fourth a few years ago, and it's jumped to the third. Of course, China is a competing major rival, but yeah, India is going through that phase of, also focusing on trade and economics with Africa. Then, of course, the Indian expatriate diaspora in skill transfer in industries such as commerce, entrepreneurship, education, and trade. We've seen Indian academics, basically skilled and semi-skilled labor groups come in and out of the continent, wherever there's been raw minerals discovered or extractive industries. There has been a huge interest in Indian markets and Indian multinationals to enter Africa, particularly. I did not mention it here, but one specific example would be countries like Zambia, Botswana, in the SADC region, where there is raw materials such as diamonds, copper. There are a lot of Indian experts on it that either advise or are in bilateral agreements for trade. And of course, India being one of the biggest countries in population in the world, they have contributed to peacekeeping forces and humanitarian assistance, particularly also in conflict regions in Africa. So we do see a lot of Indian faces, or basically South Asian faces, in conflict regions representing organizations who intervene. But now when I talk about soft power, so Bollywood, and I was interested in presenting this, and I'm very interested in knowing how what the audience thinks about this. I think Bollywood is a very powerful soft power tool, because when we look at the semantics of soft power, it trickles down to more individuals than states. So soft power affects audiences, diasporas, and the ordinary person on the street more than what we can expect from diplomats, from expatriates, because it's soft power's aim is to diffuse and disseminate the morals and ethos of cultural values and foreign attraction to the ordinary person. So US has been one of the biggest soft power nations, sorry, in the world, because we are so indulgent in their arts, entertainment, politics, and even now, how we see the US election is being portrayed even in foreign media. It's a part of soft power because we are so entangled and enthralled by it. It's a tool of consumerism as well. So I think Bollywood specifically, and this cover is from a book by Rupa Swaminathan, who actually described Bollywood as a very, very important soft power tool for India. It's unclear how it's being used or whether it's inviting direct investment, but a lot of people are now understanding Bollywood as a cultural interface of India. Sorry. So in the new millennial, the expansion of media influence and entertainment has consistently pulled global audiences to Indian soft power. And as well, we see, of course, traditionally there were foreign TV sets, foreign media narratives, TV satellite, global distributors. But in the age of Netflix and Amazon Prime and Showmax, whatever you see it, there's so many more Indian channels, shows translated as well. And I think that itself is such an important disseminator that sometimes we don't see that diplomats can have that much of an effect, or it doesn't, it's like a leveled interaction. And of course, as I mentioned, China had its moment of soft power with CCTV, media, food. India's also closing in on the line on the African continent. So Bollywood is actually a very steadfast alternative to the ideal Western values. So we see Hollywood versus Bollywood debates and Bollywood remakes of Hollywood movies, and these are all representative assets to in, especially in global South, where Bollywood is a post-liberal modern tool, where we see global South being one of the major ports of viewership. And India itself had an economic revolution in the 1990s, where we see prime ministers such as Narasimha Rao, Manmohan Singh open up Indian markets for open and free trade. And Bollywood was sort of marketed as like an escapist, very optimistic tool that's just now garnering more and more viewership, even through social media and all of that. And there's huge viewership rates in Nigeria, Mauritius, Kenya, South Africa. I would safely say that the continent is quite captured by it, and even the world. So how to use Bollywood more effectively? Sending down actors on trips, ambassadors, that's a discussion we can forward later on. But this is like the basic crux of it. Another very strong and known tool for soft power is diaspora and diplomacy. That sort of ticks the box for India. And Shashi Tharoor, the diplomat I had mentioned, also credited India's expansive diplomatic ties in part of the nation's central tool to gain prominence and centrality. So because India has such a huge population, diplomatic endeavors, journeys, interventions, talks, panels, it's always a creative circle that pushes out soft power at all the time. And because there's availability of manpower, human resources and manpower, and individual capacity, there will always be a diplomatic portal for India to engage with. And I think under Modi, that has also sort of boosted, because we do see more and more engagement, more and more trickle down effect. And with historic diasporas formed from large-scale migration in South Africa, Mauritius, Fiji, the Caribbean islands, you name it, There's also been a shift of recent wealthy expatriate bases that has been transferred to USA, Australia, Canada, and the UK. So we don't only see Africa being targeted by soft power. The Western world has also been affected by it. And I think this is also one of the advantages of globalization, where it's not only a two-sided thing. It's everyone has it's a unilateral forum. And in 2018, actually, a detour visit to South Africa, and it was a very surprise visit by the Indian president, Sri Ramnath Kovind. That surprise visit came as both a jovial detour and also a very important statement that the president made, being like, they also want to expand more expatriate bases to Africa. So it's not just South Africa, and it's not just developed economies that India is targeting. You talk about any states, large, small, India is effectively trying to build a little cultural base in wherever they can find a space to influence. And I think that's one of the big mottos of soft power, that, you know what, whether or not there is economic assistance, there is a known and familiar culture for foreign spaces to kind of familiarize themselves with. And I think diplomacy is a very big tool for it. And Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African president, in return was invited as chief guest to India's 70th Republic Day celebrations, further evidencing like a cordial diplomatic relation, which is very important as well. So we see a both side kind of effect on soft power. And of course, one of the main organs of Indian diplomacy is the Indian Council for Cultural Relations. And their entire unique mandate is to have cultural bases, have foundations, and to actually promote multiculturalism and mutual understanding through the Indian lens, and also incorporate other cultures as we go along. And there are two cultural centers in Johannesburg and Durban, and it's expanding. It's an ever-changing, fluid world. And I think diaspora and diplomacy is one thing that both China and India are banking on because of their sizable populations. So I wanted to keep it a bit exciting, because I knew that there were going to be questions related to how China and India are scrambling for Africa at the moment. And I think at the contemporary time, China is a competitor to any major power, in my eyes, because they have the economic might and they have the strive to successfully place, policies, economic assistance their way. And India's soft power is proving to be quite beneficial for them. But in that sense, within the African continent, there's a competing presence of both China and India, but to some extent, they have a divergence in interest. So China would look at more manufacturing infrastructure, more of the hard power tools, which is a reality in the contemporary world, because African states are in need for economic assistance, and they do have agency to choose for it. Hence, China has a very prominent presence. But African states also want to have more of a diplomatic tie in future organizational endeavors. So both parties have a very influential position in the continent. Now it's just down to who gets to have that ballot in Africa. But with the hefty emphasis of India's emerging soft power approach to formulating an amicable foreign policy towards Africa, one might argue that India has been underperforming when it comes to economic consolidation. Why I say this, and this being that India is still the third trade partner for Africa, is that compared to how Chinese industries, Chinese infrastructures and companies have intervened in African development, India, having such a historic and sizable diaspora, has not yet achieved China's sense of economic hold in the continent. Unfortunately, fortunately, that's still a bit murky on both sides. But despite Indians being on African soil for like as long as 5, 6 generations, there's still not a lot of hard power sentiments in Africa. But of course, this comes along with the whole question of BRICS, as you know, each stakeholder of BRICS has a certain quality to endorse in the continent, and it depends on how they strategically use it. So India-Africa relations rests more on pragmatic symbolism and social cultural engagement, which is important, but one must also realize that it's a transcendent. So there's no specific outcome that we can anticipate with soft power. So diplomacy, for example, is always dependent on situations. It's never a must go to, or it's never mandatory, as we've seen in more mixed party states where diplomacy may not be the first option or port of call. And I think with India, there is appeal, there is popularity, and it is inviting, but we're never not sure whether this pulls or pushes investment. And whereas Chinese investment in Africa has had populist outcomes of development and economic aid, and we do see it. So in areas of civil society and multinationals and diplomatic soft power, we see India is sort of on top of the race, but there's always two sides to it. In the last 5 years, in particular, India has entrenched the cultural element of soft power in this sphere, and specifically Africa because of the South-South cooperation. Similarly, we've seen African states take on a soft power narrative, even though times call for hard power sentiments. So we see Nigeria, Egypt, Mauritius, and South Africa, using each in their unique ways, have presented soft power tools. For example, Nigeria's Nollywood. So film industries, we can come to a conclusion, are a huge socio-political tool, and to an extent economic tool for consumerism and direct soft power dissemination. Egypt, tourism, Mauritius, Indian diaspora, and South Africa having their own narrative sort of up and down along the way, but there is something to offer. And like I said, soft power itself is fluid, and we may not have like an economic background or backdrop to it, but there is some sort of optimism coming out of soft power. And it is delightful to see that even though economic and military power, sovereignty are like the traditional faces of the narrative of power, soft power is given equal amount of respect right now because of the outcome and agency it yields. Some of the drawbacks of India's domestic problems that's also holding them up from participating economically is social and economic inequality, sectarian violence, but it has managed to export a modern and exciting brand for itself. So the ordinary citizen on the road can identify what Indian culture is, or has, even if it's sometimes misperceived, we can't always talk in generals. There is an image and an idea of India in the world, specifically Africa, because we see more and more of it. There is increased visibility. So that in itself is a win when it comes to appeal and popularity. And there should be some sort of improvement. And when India and China are pitched opposite, and we do know that there is intense regional rivalry, I think India should also up its economic involvement a bit to aid soft power's outcome. So we have a parallel and simultaneous sort of engagement so that we can have a sort of a desirable outcome at the end. So it doesn't polarize the whole spectrum of foreign policy. And soft power is not linear. to other hardline concepts of power. And it does have its own oscillating phases. So for example, one area would be that US might not always use hard power, right? And we see that during President Obama's term. We do see a lot of people taking interest in American culture and everything, but it's historically been good. But I would say that it's not yet so discovered, because, and someone had pointed out very smartly before I presented that, one of the questions was like, what does it do for the contemporary world? And I do think that soft power, like its name, is soft, but I think it's culturally it can gain a lot of prominence in the next few years, typically because actors want to push on a more of a neutralizing stance to it. So you can have other aspects, but soft power itself is a very important tool, and I think a lot of countries are realizing it and are practicing it. But the one downside would be that it doesn't always go the right way. And yes, that's me. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you guys.
All right, thanks so much, Simona, for that insightful overview of India's soft power in Africa and in general. I think I will open up the floor now. If anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment, you can just use the, I believe there's a raise hand function, there should be. If not, you can just send a message in the group and I will activate your screen and you can ask your question in person if you would like, or make your comment in person. While we wait for anybody who's interested in doing that, I would also just like to make a comment. I think soft power is really interesting, especially in terms of like international relations theory. If you think of constructivist ways of thinking and constructivist theory, because obviously soft power doesn't really fit in that much into the other kinds of theories. But if you start taking seriously the fact that the way that that individuals in the world perceive other individuals in other parts of the world, and that actually has an effect on what they demand of their governments. Like, for example, the fact that most Americans view China as, by default, a huge enemy, like they're the big villain in the story. Like, you can give them as many facts as you want, they will always find a way to make it against China. They will always find a way to find something suspicious about China. And that's not really a fact problem, that's a perception problem. And that's because China has been constructed in this way. And so you can imagine that in countries where China has a bit more soft power, that they actually have the ability to shape the identity or their identity in the eyes of the beholder. And obviously in Africa, there's a big thing with China where Africans on the ground, not necessarily the African elites, but Africans on the ground have a big problem with China, because we have this perception of these people are here to steal the land and to steal the minerals and all those kind of things. And again, whether that's factual or not is aside the point. The point is that the majority of people think that, and that's perpetuated by the media in Africa. And so it's interesting that India would be able to use that to shape the perception, and also to break stereotypes. I mean, most of the media that we consume comes from the West. And obviously, so we've adopted Western portrayals of things. Like if you think of a movie, it's always the bad guy is either an Islamic terrorist, a Russian mafia person, supervillain, or more recently, probably someone from China. Who your allies are and who your enemies are is very much shaped. So it's interesting to see how sort of, I'm not familiar with Bollywood at all. I mean, I know it exists, but not with the content that it produces. So it'd be interesting in future to look at, or if there are probably studies on this, to see how like who's portrayed as the good guy, who's portrayed as the bad guy in, for example, a Bollywood movie as opposed to a Western movie. Is there such a concept as a good guy and bad guy? Because I remember, just as an interesting point, China recently released one of its highest grossing sci-fi movies, and China's not notorious for its sci-fi movies. It's called Wandering Earth, and it actually it was on the box office and it actually made a huge splash internationally, which was new ground for China. And if you actually watch the show, unlike other sci-fi movies in the West, where it's usually like either aliens attacking New York and the American government stepping in and saving the world, the whole narrative here was that there was no enemy. Like the enemy in the whole, not to like give away the story or spoil it for anyone, but it was interesting for me to watch this and to realize that their whole thing is about nature is the enemy. The fact survival, anything that threatens humanity's survival is the enemy, which is very in line with the Chinese way of thinking, that we should protect people's right to life rather than get bogged down in things like politics and whatever. That obviously has its downsides as well, because then you don't like pay attention to human rights issues. But yeah, so that was just an interesting comment. It's something I thought about. Are there any other people who would like to make any comments, ask any questions? Yeah, we're keen to engage. We have about like 5 or 10 minutes left of this session.
Just a very good thing that you pointed out about Bollywood. So why I chose Bollywood was that everyone has access to Bollywood. So ETV, and their translations of it. And you mentioned about like the content they produce. So Bollywood movies and also regional Indian movies, they also have a very like antagonistic portrayal of Chinese people. And what I've realized that it also creates an identity crisis amongst nations. So I'm sure that Chinese people aren't also very fond of Indians because of the present land conflict that we are having right now, the territorial conflict. But with how I've seen and I've asked people around what they think about Bollywood, for them it's escapism. So it's about a mass merry. It's not really about, going down to the intellectuals of identity. And I think the shaping of identity, Indian norms, is basically mass merry. We're colorful, bright, vibrant people. And it does play onto how we are. But for example, exporting mega stars like Priyanka Chopra to the West, they had a completely different receival of her. And that also shifted how Western media and Western politics also portray other non-Western cultures. And that as well pits one against the other. For example, if we look at Hollywood movies, how they always talk about World War. There's always, America's victory, or the sentiment that Yankees are there, and it has a very big effect and impact on citizens, which is why soft power trickles more down to the ordinary citizens in states, because we have direct access. We are consuming the material and content. We're not going to wait for diplomats or leaders to come and tell us, because we directly have this. And because of the expansion of Netflix and other shows, we can sort of think and perceive our own ideals on it, and that itself is a huge, I think, disruption to mega narratives. But we do see downsides as well, because, for example, China, the government has to approve of whatever content in the entertainment industry. So if it's blasphemous, or if it doesn't portray a certain vision of China, then it gets blocked. India, it's not yet there is censorship, but there's another thing, is that Indian movies also, one side is patriotic, the other side venerating Western countries. So going to USA, going to UK is like a lifelong generational dream, and that's portrayed in Indian movies, and that's what young Indians, old Indians aspire to. So we do see, like, there is, if we go into it, there is a dichotomy of how Bollywood itself manifests. So the cover that I used for the Bollywood slide, it's a book by Rupa Swaminathan, and she says that Bollywood itself is a huge policy on its own that can be detected on either side. So soft power, actually, it's a very interesting constructivist idea, and I think a lot of countries are using it now, because they've been using it, but they're now putting more mind to it, because attraction and appeal can go a long way. So I'm not saying that putting soft power on the table will guarantee you foreign direct investment. that's just one step. You'll have many steps to build the ladder, and it can come through.
Yeah, no, definitely. We have one question, or I think it's a question, but it's also kind of a comment. But I think so. It's from Yun Sum Wong, who says, "I wonder how Indians think about China for the current conflict with China and during the conflict." So, sort of contrasting that, because you did just mention that, especially now, there's a bit of a spat between that. So, I'm not sure to what extent you like China-India relations as part of your field and what you specifically focus on in your research. But yeah, if you could comment a bit on that. I mean, you did just mention that in Bollywood, there's usually a negative portrayal of China, of Chinese people and Chinese culture. So how does that what does that say about the pre-conflict now and the current conflict situations, perceptions from the Indian side?
So it does, and the person that also sent you the question about how it's affecting African states, and I think I wanted to use China as an example because India went very hardline on China. They blocked Chinese apps in India, TikTok, and there were other social media apps that were blocked. There are some fringe element media channels that consistently portray China as the bad guy, consistently say that China is intruding, invading. So generally, the general in like public, I think in young Indians are apathetic to conflict, in the sense that when we see historically how Pakistan, India has had like a very historic negative vibe around the region, China, India, it's going, but the more liberal minded young crowd are saying that there are tools that can solve it, but the more conservative flagged people, and unfortunately successive governments have had a very conservative view on China, there is animosity. And I'm not going to deny that there's been like equal agitation on both sides, whereas Chinese diplomats have also not misbehaved, but they've done quite a bit on Indian soil, and the same going there. I do think that President Xi and Modi are willing to talk it out, but it's just there is conflict and everyone's aware of it. And if you ask the ordinary citizen on the road, their view of China is minuscule. They don't think beyond maybe chow mein or dumplings. And I say this because in urban areas, we find the demographics more inclined to educating themselves on these premier issues. But if we go into the hinterlands, they're not really careful on how they get fed the media. So there are some news channels that are doing pretty harsh stuff on Chinese narratives. And I think the problem with big countries such as China and India and their simultaneous parallel narratives are that they have so much influence on their citizens. So Chinese government will say something that the public will adhere to. Indian government will say something and will adhere to that. So they both have their own parallel concept. But right now, from the faint perception that I have, the right-wing conservative view of China is rising, and there are people, liberal-minded people, that say that it's all about a constructivist idea of how the Chinese identity is formed. But the quick example that I can give is they are Indians of Chinese descent, Indo-Chinese people in the Northeast, and they're called Northeast people, and that itself is problematic. But they have been shunned and marginalized. I mean, they're Indian citizens, but they're not looked upon as real Indians because they have Chinese heritage, or they have a different Indo-Chinese or a Sino culture that they conform to, or they have a mixed sort of heritage, and they're not in the mainstream, and that is racism. And that's the first opening step to realizing how Indians also perceive, if Indians can shun Northeast people who are Indians but of Chinese descent, then China itself is a huge rivalry. I think also the regional rivalry and their preference, because India, some of them are big Trump supporters, and China is struggling to keep that balance in the region where they are opposing America. That also has a big effect on political preferences. So yeah, I think the current situation is bleak, and we do expect that quite a few firearms and intrusions will happen in the near future, because I think territorially Pakistan and China are quite susceptible to territorial conflict, and India doesn't hold back. So yeah.
Right.